Okay, let's talk about an older commander today. Yarok the Desecrated is one commander that I really like. The problem is that it's really boring to build and play. You just stuff the deck with the best things that enter the battlefield and call it a day. Of course, that's really boring, and anyone who plays against a Yarok deck can see what's coming from a mile away. So, I built a budget counters deck with Yarok instead. In case you didn't know, Yarok is a 3/5 legendary elemental horror with Death Touch and Lifelink that costs 2 black, green, blue. It says if a permanent entering the battlefield causes a triggered ability of a permanent you control to trigger, that ability triggers an additional time. So, we want to actually end the game and not spend hours drawing cards and playing with ETB effects and combos. So, we'll start with the cards that will make our creatures bigger with counters. Oath of the Ancient Wood is an enchantment that says when it or another enchantment enters the battlefield, you can put a 1/1 counter on target creature. Oran Reef Ooze does the same when it enters, but when it attacks, you can put a 1/1 counter on each attacking creature with a 1/1 counter on it. Retreat to Kazandu is an enchantment that says when a land enters the battlefield, choose 1. Put a 1/1 counter on a target creature or gain 2 life. Simeon's Simulacrum is a 2/1 artifact creature for 3 that says when it ETBs, put 2 1/1 counters on a creature you control. It has Unearth for 2 and 2 greens, so if it's taken out or milled, you can still get access to this effect after Yarok is on the field. Cytoplast Rootkin is a 0/0 elemental mutant with Graft 4. This means it enters with 4 1/1 counters on it, and whenever another creature ETBs, you may move a counter from this creature onto it. And finally, you can pay 2 to move a 1/1 counter from another creature you control onto Cytoplast Rootkin. This creature seems weak at first until you realize that it's good at both stages of the game. When you have no creatures with counters on them, this will give them counters as they enter. Then, if you have a board full of creatures with counters on them, this will give all of them another 1/1 counter. Then, if it's running low on counters to donate, you can pay 2 to put counters on it with your extra mana to feed it counters to graft. It's a pretty solid creature for this strategy. Forgotten Ancient is a 0/3 that says whenever a player casts a spell, you may put a 1/1 counter on it. At the beginning of your upkeep, you may move any number of 1/1 counters from Forgotten Ancient onto other creatures. In a game of Commander, this can get quite a few counters on it by the time it gets back to your turn, and then you can put those counters on creatures that you want to smack your opponents with. Goliath Truck is a 4/4 vehicle for 4 with Crew 2 that says when it attacks, put 2 1/1 counters on another target attacking creature. Nightshade Harvester is a 2/2 that says whenever a land enters the battlefield under an opponent's control, that player loses 1 life and put a 1/1 counter on Nightshade Harvester. And yes, this will double with Yarok. Yarok says if a permanent entering, this means any permanent, even your opponent's, causes a triggered ability of a permanent you control to trigger, it triggers again. You control the Nightshade Harvester, so you get the effect twice when an opponent's land enters the battlefield. I need to buy this card because that effect, even without Yarok, is pretty good. It'd even be a pretty good include in many Aristocrats decks, I think. And Path of Discovery is an enchantment that says whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, it explores. Explore says reveal the top card of your library, put that card into your hand if it's a land, otherwise put a 1/1 counter on the creature, then put the card back or put it into your graveyard. The Slippery Bogbonder is a 3/3 with flash and hexproof that says when it enters the battlefield, put a hexproof counter on target creature, then move any number of counters from among creatures you control onto that creature. While 4 mana is a lot for instant hexproof on a creature, being able to make it bigger with counters sort of makes up for it, I think. Drana, Liberator of Malakir, is here, of course. She's a 2/3 with flying and first strike that says when she deals combat damage to a player, put a 1/1 counter on each attacking creature you control. Then we have Roalisk Apex Hybrid, a 4/5 legendary human mutant with flying and trample for 2, 2 green, and a blue that says, when it ETBs, put 2 1/1 counters on another target creature you control. When it dies, proliferate, then proliferate again. Proliferate says choose any number of permanents and or players, then give each another counter of each kind already there, then do it again. So, now that we've successfully put counters on our creatures, let's find ways to multiply them. Winding Constrictor is a 2/3 snake for black and green that says if one or more counters would be placed on an artifact or creature you control, that many of those counters plus 1 are placed on that permanent instead. If you would get 1 or more counters, you get that many plus 1 instead. Evolution Sage is a 3/2 elf druid that says whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, proliferate. With Yarok out, this happens twice, so have fun with that. I didn't include Corpsejack Menace with this group because it doesn't do anything when it enters and it costs 4 to get onto the field. It's very clunky to use unless you're ramping hard, and it's only a matter of time before Wizards puts this effect on a better creature anyway. If any set is going to have this jacked up on a better creature, it's going to be the new Phyrexia sets coming out. Now that we have a handful of big creatures, let's send them off to poke our opponents. But before we do that, why don't you poke that like button and sub to the channel if you like what you see so far and want to catch more in the future. We're really close to 1 million subs, and with your help, this channel will get there before the end of the century. Bramblewood Paragon is a 2/2 that says each other warrior you control enters with an additional 1/1 counter on it. But more importantly, each creature you control with a 1/1 counter on it has trample. Duskshell Crawler does the same thing but will let you put a 1/1 counter on a target creature when it ETBs. Gnarled Colony is a 2/2 for 1 and a green with Kicker for 2 and a green that says if it was kicked, it enters the battlefield with 2 1/1 counters on it. And each creature you control with a 1/1 counter on it has trample. Pride Malkin is a 2/1 that will let you put a 1/1 counter on a creature you control when it ETBs, and will give each creature you control with a 1/1 counter on it trample. Hogger Constrictor enters the battlefield with 2 1/1 counters on it, and gives each creature you control with a 1/1 counter on it menace. Skatewing Spy is a 2/3 that says pay 5 and a blue to adapt 2. If it has no 1/1 counters on it, put 2 1/1 counters on it. Then, each creature you control with a 1/1 counter on it has flying. Una's Blackguard is kind of mean. It's a 1/1 flying fairy rogue that says each other rogue creature you control enters with an additional 1/1 counter on it. And whenever a creature you control with a 1/1 counter on it deals combat damage to a player, that player discards a card. And while they're discarding their cards, you'll want to be drawing more. Kenrith's Transformation will draw a card when it ETBs, but it will also make the enchanted creature lose all abilities and become a 3/3 elk. Abundant Growth is a land enchantment that will give us a bit of color fixing and draw a card when it ETBs. Urban Utopia does the exact same thing for 1 more colorless mana. Benthic Biomancer is a 1/1 for 1 blue with adapt 1 for 1 in a blue. It says whenever 1 or more 1/1 counters are put on Benthic Biomancer, draw a card, then discard a card. Baleful Strix is a 1/1 with flying and death touch that draws a card when it ETBs. Omen of the Sea is an enchantment with flash that lets you scry 2, then draw a card when it ETBs. It also says pay 2 and a blue to sack it to scry 2. Bred for the Hunt is an enchantment that says whenever a creature you control with a 1/1 counter on it deals combat damage to a player, you may draw a card. Armorcraft Judge is a 3/3 for 3 and a green that says when it ETBs, draw a card for each creature you control with a 1/1 counter on it. And then we have Inspiring Call, an instant for 2 and a green that says draw a card for each creature you control with a 1/1 counter on it. Then those creatures gain indestructible until end of turn. Unfortunately, this only saves creatures with counters on them, but we have other ways of protecting our creatures. Plaxcaster Frogling is a 0/0 frog mutant with Graft 3. It says pay 2 to give a creature with a 1/1 counter on it Shroud until end of turn. Tameo Safekeeping is an instant for a green that says target permanent you control gains hexproof and indestructible until end of turn. You gain 2 life. Gaia's Gift is an instant for 1 and a green that says put a 1/1 counter on target creature you control. It gains Reach, Trample, Hexproof, and Indestructible until end of turn. The versatility on this thing is absurd. You can make a creature bigger and give it Trample to get through to finish an opponent off. It gets Reach and Indestructible to block flying threats, or you can give it Hexproof to protect it from your opponents. But I mean, of course it would do all that. It's in green. Since those cards only protect individual creatures, we have a few counterspells to stop board wipes and other troublesome effects. Negate is here, of course. Essence Capture will counter a creature spell and give one of our creatures a 1/1 counter. Spell Rupture will counter a target spell unless its controller pays X, where X is the greatest power among creatures we control. This should be pretty difficult to pay once we start getting our 1/1 counters going. Defabricate will either counter an enchantment or artifact spell, or it'll counter an activated activated or triggered ability, so there's a bit of flexibility here. Once Yarok is out, everything that is happening gets doubled, so let's add some cards that will make great use of that effect. Confounding Conundrum is an enchantment that draws you a card when it ETBs, but even better for you, it says whenever a land ETBs under an opponent's control, if that player had another land enter the battlefield under their control this turn, they return a land they control to the owner's hand. Now, this effect isn't fantastic for low power matches, but it certainly has the potential to ruin someone's day. Exchange of Words is an enchantment that says when it ETBs, it swaps the text box of 2 target creatures as long as it's on the field. Curse of the Restless Dead is a curse that says when a land enters the battlefield under enchanted player's control, you create a 2/2 black zombie with Decayed. Now, while this isn't the greatest effect, these zombies can add up as time goes on and will help get through with numbers if your opponent can't block a lot of creatures at one time. Jugen Defends the Temple is a saga that says create a 1/1 monk with tap to add green, put a 1/1 counter on each of up to 2 creatures, and exile it then return it as Remnant of the Rising Star. A 2/2 Flying Dragon Spirit that says whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, you may pay X. When you do, put X 1/1 counters on that creature. Then, as long as you control 5 or more modified creatures, it gets +5/+5 and has Trample. Knight Paladin is a 6/6 vehicle with Trample and Crew 1 for 5 that says when it ETBs, it deals 4 damage to each opponent. 4 is nice, but 8 is amazing with Yarok out, and it's a beefy beater. And just in case our creatures aren't quite big enough to get through, we have Overrun in here to give our creatures +3/+3 and Trample until end of turn. And of course we have Eternal Witness here because it's just too good not to include in a Yarok deck. When it ETBs, you can return a target card from your graveyard to your hand. Champion of Lamholt is great here. It's a 1/1 for 1 and 2 green that says creatures with power less than champions can't block creatures you control. It also says when another creature ETBs under your control, put a 1/1 counter on champion, making its range of unblockable creatures wider at a very fast pace, especially with Yarok out. Clown Car is a 1/1 vehicle with Crew 2 for X that says when it ETBs, roll X 6-sided die. For each odd result, create a 1/1 Clown Robot Artifact creature token. For each even result, put a 1/1 counter on the car. We can do this twice when Yarok is out, which is basically doubling the mana we put into it. Now, to make sure we can get enough mana to do all of these shenanigans, let's add some ramp. Farhaven Elf, Omen of the Hunt, and Yavimaya Granger will all let us search for a basic land and put it onto the battlefield tapped. Jewel Thief is a 3/3 with Vigilance and Trample. You get a treasure when it ETBs, which will let you ramp a little bit, but its size and keywords make it the perfect creature to throw counters on, making it more useful than our other rampy creatures. Springbloom Druid is a 1/1 elf druid that says when it enters the battlefield, you may sacrifice a land. If you do, search your library for up to 2 basic lands, put them onto the battlefield tapped. It only ramps you once, but if you're struggling for fixing, this will take care of that for you, especially in a 3-color deck like this. And then we have our classic suite of signets, Arcane, Dimir, Golgari, and Simic. Sol Ring isn't here because it only gives us colorless mana, and in this budget build, I'm more concerned with getting our 3 colors of different mana set up. Our removal package is Green Slime, which will counter an activated or triggered ability from an artifact or enchantment. If it's countered, it will destroy that permanent at flash speed. Manglehorn will destroy an artifact when it ETBs, but it will also cause artifacts of our opponents to enter the battlefield tapped. Reclamation Sage will destroy an artifact or enchantment when it ETBs for 2 and a green, while Foundation Breaker will do the same for an evoke cost of 1 and a green. And of course, Ravenous Chupacabra to destroy a target creature when it ETBs. Okay, so we might not have enough creature removal here, but you can replace weak or not relevant cards in your own version with things like Mutant's Prey and Titanic Brawl, or other fighting effects you might like. And finally, our miscellaneous cards. Court of Bounty will give us Monarch when it enters the battlefield, and at the beginning of our upkeep, we can put a land from our hand onto the battlefield. If we're the Monarch, we can put a creature or land from our hand onto the battlefield instead. And then Bajukabog is here to take care of problematic graveyard strategies. And as long as I didn't miss anything, that's it for our Yarok deck. Dumping the list into TCG Player and fixing all of the overpriced cards we end up with a total of $33.83, with $4.50 of that being shipping. We have 63 spells and 37 lands totals, but that price does not include the cost of Yarok, which is, I think, a $17 deck right now. So yeah, that's without the commander. So we have 63 spells and 37 lands total, since Yarok can be at Lightning Rod for removal. So those lands can be whatever you have available, but this deck specifically is 62% green, 24% blue, and 14% black. So you'd want the same amounts of color distribution if possible. And that's it. Yay! Let me know what you think of this Yarok budget counters deck in the comments below, or how you built your own Yarok deck as well. Like the video if you liked the video, dislike it if you disliked it, and until next time, I'm Space Coconut, and you're welcome.